Jake, a hardworking teen waiter, forms an unexpected bond with an elderly woman, Mrs. Thompson, who dines alone every night. When she suddenly stops coming, he discovers she has passed away, but she's left him something life-changing. A notebook filled with the unfinished designs of her late husband, a legendary architect. Inspired, Jake follows his dream, gets into college, and rises in the world of architecture. Years later, he honors her legacy on the grand stage, proving that kindness and mentorship can change a life forever. If you love these types of stories, don't forget to comment down below where you are watching from. You can support us by liking this video and subscribing to our YouTube channel. Jake was a 17-year-old high school senior juggling school, work, and the responsibilities of helping his single mother, Lisa, with household expenses. He worked as a waiter at Mal's Diner, a small, family-owned restaurant that had been in the neighborhood for decades. The diner was cozy, with checkered floors, red leather booths, and a jukebox in the corner that played old rock and country hits. It was the kind of place where regulars felt like family, and newcomers were welcomed with warm smiles and steaming plates of homemade food. Jake had taken the job 6 months ago, hoping to save up some money for college. He dreamed of becoming an architect, a passion ignited by the hours he spent sketching buildings in his notebook. But between school, late-night shifts, and trying to keep up with homework, he often found himself exhausted. Still, he knew he had to push through. His mother worked 2 jobs, and he wanted to do his part to ease her burden. Among the many customers that came and went, there was one Jake had come to recognize instantly. Every evening, just before closing time, an elderly woman walked in, dressed in a neatly pressed cardigan and a long skirt, always carrying a small purse tucked under her arm. She had a kind yet mysterious aura about her, and despite her frail frame, there was something regal in the way she carried herself. Her name was Mrs. Thompson. Mrs. Thompson always sat at the same booth in the far corner, by the window. The dim light from the street lamps outside cast a soft glow around her as she gazed out the window, lost in thought. Without fail, she would order the same meal each night, a small bowl of tomato soup and a cup of tea. At first, Jake hadn't thought much of her visits. He had seen his fair share of regular customers, truck drivers stopping by for a quick meal, couples on dates, and groups of friends sharing laughter over burgers and milkshakes. But there was something different about Mrs. Thompson. She never seemed to be in a hurry, and unlike most customers who came in pairs or groups, she always dined alone. As the weeks passed, Jake began to look forward to seeing her. He noticed the little things, how she always folded her napkin neatly on the table before leaving, how she stirred her tea twice before taking a sip, and how she always smiled warmly when he came to take her order. It was a small, comforting routine in the midst of his hectic life. One evening, curiosity got the best of him. As he placed her tea on the table, he decided to strike up a conversation. "Cold night out there, huh?" he said, setting the cup down carefully. Mrs. Thompson looked up from the window, her eyes twinkling with amusement. "It certainly is. But a little chill never hurt anyone," she replied with a gentle smile. Jake chuckled. "I don't know about that. I think I'd rather stay inside with a hot cup of coffee." She nodded, wrapping her fingers around the teacup as if absorbing its warmth. Sometimes, the cold reminds us to appreciate the warmth when we have it. Something about the way she spoke intrigued Jake. There was wisdom in her words, the kind that came with a lifetime of experiences. From that night on, their conversations became a routine. At first, they were simple, discussing the weather, the food at the diner, or the books she always carried in her purse. But as time went on, their conversations deepened. She told him about her late husband, how they used to dance in their living room to jazz records, and how she missed the days when their house was filled with laughter. In turn, Jake found himself opening up as well. He told her about his love for architecture, how he spent hours sketching buildings and imagining the places he wanted to design. He told her about his mother, how hard she worked, and how he wished he could do more to help. Mrs. Thompson listened intently, never interrupting, never offering empty words of comfort. Instead, she simply nodded, as if she understood. And somehow, that was enough. One night, as he brought her check to the table, she placed a hand on his. "You're a good boy, Jake," she said softly. "You have a kind heart. Don't ever lose that. For reasons he couldn't quite explain, those words stayed with him long after she had left. He didn't know much about Mrs. Thompson, where she lived, if she had children, or why she always dined alone, but in some strange way, she had become one of the most important people in his life. Little did he know, their simple exchanges were about to change his life in ways he never imagined. Jake began anticipating Mrs. Thompson's visits as much as she seemed to enjoy coming to the diner. Every evening, as the last customers left and the lights dimmed slightly, he would already have her tea brewing and her soup ready to be served. He took pride in the little details, making sure her tea was steeped for exactly the right amount of time, bringing her an extra napkin before she even had to ask, and ensuring she always had the best seat by the window. Their conversations, which had started as small talk, gradually evolved into something deeper. Mrs. Thompson was unlike anyone he had ever met. She spoke with a quiet elegance, her words measured and full of wisdom. She never wasted a sentence, never filled the silence with unnecessary chatter. She had a way of making even the simplest moments feel significant. One night, as Jake cleared a nearby table, he overheard a group of teenagers mocking the idea of wasting time talking to an old lady. It made his blood boil. He glanced at Mrs. Thompson, expecting her to be upset, but she only smiled knowingly. "People fear what they don't understand," she said softly, taking a slow sip of her tea. "They think youth lasts forever, that kindness is a sign of weakness. But they'll learn." Her words stuck with him. She had a way of turning every situation into a life lesson, and Jake found himself hanging on to every word. She told him about the time she had traveled across the country with nothing but a suitcase and a dream, about the struggles of being a woman in a field dominated by men, and how she had learned to find strength in solitude rather than fear it. Jake, in turn, told her about his aspirations. He described the buildings he wanted to design, the skylines he wanted to shape. She listened, truly listened, and it made him feel like his dreams mattered. He wished more people in his life had her patience, her ability to make the world feel a little less overwhelming. Little did he know, Mrs. Thompson had plans for him, plans that would change his life forever. One evening, Jake stood near the entrance of the diner, glancing at the clock on the wall. It was already past the time when Mrs. Thompson usually arrived, yet her usual seat by the window remained empty. A strange unease settled in his stomach. She had never missed a night before. He reassured himself that perhaps she had gotten caught up with something, but as the hours ticked by and the diner closed, the unease only grew stronger. The following night he kept an eye on the door, hoping to see her familiar figure walk in, but she never came. Days passed, and with each one, Jake found himself worrying more. He had never realized how much of a routine Mrs. Thompson had become in his life until she was suddenly missing from it. He regretted never asking for more details about her life, where she lived, if she had any family. He had assumed she would always be there, sipping her tea, sharing her stories, offering her quiet wisdom. One night, after his shift ended, he made a decision. He asked around the neighborhood, hoping someone might know something about her. Most people recognized her name but knew little about her personal life. Just when he was beginning to lose hope, one of the older customers, Mr. Harris, an elderly man who had been coming to Mel's diner for years, overheard his conversation and spoke up. "Mrs. Thompson? I used to see her at the community center," he said, adjusting his glasses. "She volunteered there for years, helping kids with their reading. But I haven't seen her in a while either." Jake's heart raced. A new lead. The next morning, on his day off, he visited the community center, a small brick building that had served as a hub for neighborhood activities for decades. Inside, he was greeted by a warm-faced woman who introduced herself as Linda, the center's coordinator. When he mentioned Mrs. Thompson's name, Linda's expression softened. "Oh dear, you must be the young man from the diner she always talks about," she said with a small smile. "She adores you." Jake felt a lump form in his throat. "Do you know where she is?" "She hasn't come by the diner in days, and I'm really worried." Linda hesitated for a moment before sighing. "Mrs. Thompson has been in the hospital. She collapsed at home a few days ago. She's stable now, but she doesn't have any close family around to take care of her." Jake's heart sank. Without thinking twice, he asked for the hospital's address and rushed there as soon as he could. When he finally reached her room, he found her sitting up in bed, looking out the window much like she did at the diner. She turned at the sound of his footsteps, her eyes lighting up with surprise and warmth. "Jake," she said softly, a smile spreading across her tired face. "What are you doing here?" He stepped closer, struggling to keep his emotions in check. "I was worried about you, Mrs. Thompson. You didn't show up at the diner and I didn't know where you were." She reached for his hand, squeezing it gently. "I didn't mean to worry you, dear. I suppose my body just had other plans." Jake swallowed hard, realizing how much she meant to him. "You should have told me you weren't feeling well. I could have helped." She chuckled lightly. "You already have, Jake. More than you know." As he sat beside her, they talked just like they did at the diner. Only this time, Jake wasn't just a waiter serving a regular customer. He was a friend visiting someone who had become family. And at that moment, he realized something: family wasn't just about blood. It was about the people who showed up when you needed them the most. And he was going to make sure Mrs. Thompson was never alone again. Jake visited Mrs. Thompson every day after his shift, bringing her flowers from a nearby shop or a warm cup of her favorite tea. Each time he arrived, her face would light up, and they would talk as if they were still sitting in the cozy corner booth of Mel's diner. She told him stories from her past, about the dreams she once had, and the people she had loved and lost. He listened intently, knowing that these conversations meant as much to her as they did to him. The hospital room was no substitute for the diner, but it became their new meeting place, a space where their bond continued to grow. One evening, as Jake helped adjust the blankets on her bed, Mrs. Thompson looked at him with a softness in her eyes. "Jake, I want you to promise me something," she said, her voice steady but laced with something deeper. "Anything," he replied without hesitation. She reached for his hand, her grip weak but firm. "Promise me that you'll never stop chasing your dreams. Life has a way of pulling us in different directions, making us forget what we truly want. But don't let that happen to you. Keep drawing, keep dreaming, and never settle for less than what you deserve." Jake swallowed hard, feeling the weight of her words. "I promise," he said, meaning every syllable. Over the next few weeks, Mrs. Thompson's health slowly improved, though she remained frail. One afternoon, Jake arrived to find her sitting up in bed, flipping through an old photo album. She patted the spot next to her, inviting him to sit. "I want to show you something," she said, turning the pages carefully. The pictures were old, some faded at the edges, but Jake could still make out the faces of the people in them. He recognized a younger version of Mrs. Thompson, standing beside a distinguished-looking man. "That's my husband," she said softly. "We built a life together. He was an architect, you know." Jake's eyes widened. "An architect?" She nodded, smiling at his reaction. "Yes. He designed buildings all over the country. I used to sit with him while he sketched, just like you do." She turned another page, revealing drawings that looked eerily similar to Jake's own sketches. "These were his designs," she said. "He always believed in creating something that would last, something that would make a difference." Jake traced a finger over the faded lines of a blueprint. It was beautiful, detailed, and full of passion. "He sounds like an incredible man," he murmured. "He was," Mrs. Thompson said. "And you remind me of him, Jake. The way you talk about your dreams, the way your eyes light up when you describe your sketches, it's the same passion he had." He felt a lump form in his throat. "Mrs. Thompson, she placed a hand over his. "You have a gift, Jake. Don't be afraid to use it." The next day, Jake arrived at the hospital to find an envelope waiting for him at the front desk. Inside was a letter written in Mrs. Thompson's delicate handwriting. It read, "Dear Jake, if you're reading this, it means I wasn't able to tell you in person what I wanted to say. But know that meeting you has been one of the greatest joys of my life. You have reminded me of what it means to dream, to believe in something bigger than ourselves. Enclosed is something that belonged to my husband. I want you to have it. Use it well, and never stop building the future you deserve. With love, Mrs. Thompson." Inside the envelope was an old leather-bound notebook filled with architectural sketches, notes, and ideas. Tears welled in Jake's eyes as he held it in his hands. He knew at that moment that this was more than just a gift. It was a legacy, a promise he intended to keep. Jake held the notebook in his hands, running his fingers over the worn leather cover. He had never felt a weight like this before, not one of burden, but of purpose. Mrs. Thompson had given him more than just a book of sketches. She had entrusted him with a dream, a legacy. That night, he sat at his small desk in his bedroom, flipping through the pages, studying the intricate designs her husband had left behind. The blueprints were more than just drawings. They were visions of what could be, creations meant to last beyond a single lifetime. As he traced over the lines with his fingers, he felt a fire ignite inside him. He needed to do something with this, to honor Mrs. Thompson's gift in a way that mattered. The next morning, he made a decision. He would apply for the architecture program at the local university. It was a dream he had kept locked away, believing it to be out of reach. But now, with Mrs. Thompson's encouragement and the notebook in his possession, he felt something he hadn't before: confidence. He spent the next few weeks preparing his portfolio, using the notebook's designs as inspiration. Every night after his shift at the diner, he stayed up sketching, refining his work, pouring his heart into each page. He visited Mrs. Thompson whenever he could, sharing his progress with her. Though she had grown weaker, her smile never faded. "I knew you had it in you," she whispered one afternoon, gripping his hand. "You were meant for this, Jake." One day, Jake arrived at the hospital with exciting news. He had been accepted into the program. He rushed to Mrs. Thompson's room, eager to tell her, but when he stepped inside, he found her bed empty. A nurse stood by the window, folding a blanket. Jake's heart pounded. "Where is she?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. The nurse turned, sympathy in her eyes. "I'm so sorry, Jake. Mrs. Thompson passed away early this morning." The world seemed to tilt around him. He staggered back, gripping the doorframe for support. He had known this moment was coming, but nothing could have prepared him for the finality of it. Tears blurred his vision as he sank into the chair beside her empty bed. He reached into his pocket, pulling out the acceptance letter he had been so eager to show her. "I got in," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I did it, Mrs. Thompson." He wiped at his eyes, clutching the letter tightly. Though she was gone, he could still feel her presence, hear her voice encouraging him, reminding him to never stop chasing his dreams. A week later, the diner felt different. The corner booth where Mrs. Thompson had always sat seemed emptier than ever. Jake still expected to see her walking through the door, greeting him with that warm smile. But instead of sadness, he felt something else: determination. He would make her proud. On the day of her memorial service, Jake stood in front of a small crowd of people who had known and loved Mrs. Thompson. He held the notebook close to his chest as he spoke about the woman who had changed his life. "She believed in me when I didn't believe in myself," he said, his voice strong despite the lump in his throat. "She taught me that dreams don't die as long as someone is willing to carry them forward. And that's exactly what I plan to do." As he stepped down, he felt lighter, as if Mrs. Thompson's spirit was walking beside him. And in that moment he knew he wasn't just chasing a dream. He was carrying on a legacy. Jake stood outside the university's architecture department, his acceptance letter clenched tightly in his hand. The campus bustled with students, each carrying their own dreams and ambitions. As he walked through the doors, he felt the weight of Mrs. Thompson's notebook in his backpack, a reminder of the promise he had made to her. The first few weeks of classes were overwhelming. The coursework was challenging, the expectations high, but every time he felt discouraged, he would open the notebook and study the intricate sketches her husband had left behind. It was as if the lines on the page spoke to him, guiding him forward. Late one night, while working in the studio, his professor, Dr. Whitman, stopped by his desk. "These are impressive designs, Jake," he said, flipping through Jake's sketches. "Where do you draw your inspiration from?" Jake hesitated for a moment before pulling out the notebook. "From here," he said, handing it to Dr. Whitman. The professor studied the pages carefully, his eyebrows raising in recognition. "This is remarkable," he murmured. "These designs, they remind me of Richard Thompson's work." Jake's breath caught in his throat. "You knew him?" Dr. Whitman nodded. He was a legend in the field, an innovator. His work influenced a generation of architects. Where did you get this? Jake swallowed hard before explaining everything. His nights at the diner, his friendship with Mrs. Thompson, the promise he made to her. Dr. Whitman listened intently, his expression unreadable. When Jake finished, the professor placed a hand on his shoulder. Jake, you have something special here. If you're willing to put in the work, I believe you could make a name for yourself, just like Richard did. That night, Jake worked harder than ever, sketching, refining, and pushing himself to create designs that would honor the legacy he had inherited. Months passed, and with each project, his confidence grew. He entered a student competition using a concept inspired by one of Richard Thompson's unfinished designs. When the results were announced, Jake could hardly believe it. He had won. The victory came with an internship opportunity at a prestigious firm, a chance to learn from some of the best architects in the industry. On his first day at the firm, he walked into the office with Mrs. Thompson's notebook in hand. As he looked around at the towering buildings outside the window, he felt a familiar warmth in his heart. He wasn't just following a dream, he was fulfilling a promise, carrying forward a legacy that had found him in the most unexpected way. And in that moment, he knew he was exactly where he was meant to be. Jake's first weeks at the architecture firm were nothing short of intense. He was surrounded by some of the brightest minds in the industry, each one with years of experience and portfolios filled with awe-inspiring projects. The transition from being a student to working on real-world projects felt overwhelming at times, but every time doubt crept in, he would remind himself of Mrs. Thompson's unwavering belief in him. He stayed late after hours, studying blueprints, absorbing as much knowledge as he could, and pushing himself beyond his limits. His mentor, a senior architect named Mr. Reynolds, quickly noticed his dedication. "You've got a sharp eye, Jake," he remarked one evening as they pored over a new project proposal. "Where did you learn to refine your designs like this?" Jake smiled, tapping the worn notebook that never left his side. "A very special person helped me see the world differently," he said. As months passed, Jake was given more responsibility, eventually working on his own section of a major commercial project. It was a high-pressure assignment, one that required precision, creativity, and problem-solving under tight deadlines. He spent long nights perfecting his designs, often whispering a quiet "thank you" to Mrs. Thompson for guiding him on this journey. One afternoon, the firm received an invitation to a prestigious architecture gala, an event where top industry leaders gathered to discuss groundbreaking projects. Mr. Reynolds approached Jake with an unexpected proposition. "I want you to present our latest project at the gala," he said. Jake's eyes widened. "Me? You've put your heart into this design, and I think you should be the one to showcase it," Mr. Reynolds affirmed. The thought of standing in front of an audience filled with industry giants made Jake's stomach churn with nerves, but he knew this was an opportunity he couldn't turn down. On the night of the gala, he stood backstage, adjusting his tie and taking deep breaths. He pulled out Mrs. Thompson's notebook one last time, flipping to a page where she had written, "Believe in yourself, Jake. The world needs your vision." With those words echoing in his mind, he stepped onto the stage. As he spoke, his passion for architecture shone through. He explained how his design was inspired by the work of Richard Thompson and how the concept honored both tradition and innovation. When he finished, the room was silent for a moment before erupting into applause. After the event, a well-dressed older man approached him, extending a hand. "That was an incredible presentation," he said. "Richard Thompson was a dear friend of mine. Hearing how his legacy inspired your work, it's truly moving." Jake's heart pounded as he shook the man's hand. "Thank you. He and his wife changed my life in ways I never expected." The man smiled. "I have no doubt that they'd be proud of you." As Jake left the gala that night, he looked up at the skyline, his heart full. He had come so far from the small-town diner where his journey began. And in that moment, he knew his story was just beginning. The days following the gala were a whirlwind for Jake. His presentation had not only impressed the audience but had also caught the attention of a renowned architecture firm in New York City. One morning, as he settled into his usual workspace, his mentor, Mr. Reynolds, approached him with an envelope. "You've received an invitation," he said with a knowing smile. Jake opened it and read the letter inside. The firm, one of the most prestigious in the country, was offering him a position, an opportunity to work alongside some of the greatest architects in the world. He couldn't believe it. This was the kind of opportunity most young architects only dreamed of. That evening, he sat alone in his apartment, staring at Mrs. Thompson's notebook. He thought about everything: the long nights at the diner, the wisdom she had shared, and the journey that had led him here. He wished she were still around to see this moment. The next day, he called Mrs. Thompson's lawyer, who had been handling her affairs. "I need to visit her home one last time," he said. The lawyer agreed and handed him the keys. Walking through the house, Jake felt a wave of nostalgia. He ran his fingers along the spines of the books she had always cherished, looked at the framed photos of her and Richard, and finally he entered Richard's old study. On the desk, he noticed a stack of letters tied together with a ribbon. Curious, he opened the top one. It was a letter from Richard to his wife, written years before his passing. In it, Richard spoke of his dreams, his vision for future architects, and his hope that one day, someone young and passionate would carry on his legacy. Tears welled in Jake's eyes. He realized, at that moment, that he had become that person. With renewed determination, he packed his things and prepared for the move to New York. On his last night in town, he visited the diner one final time. He took a seat at the table where Mrs. Thompson had always sat. As he looked around, memories flooded his mind. The laughter, the conversations, the bond they had shared. The owner, who had watched Jake's journey unfold, walked over and placed a slice of pie in front of him. "On the house," he said. "Mrs. Thompson would be proud of you." Jake smiled, taking a bite and savoring the moment. The next morning, he boarded a plane to New York, carrying with him Mrs. Thompson's notebook and the lessons she had taught him. As the city skyline came into view, he knew that this was just the beginning of another chapter. He had honored his promise, but now, it was time to build a legacy of his own. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this story, be sure to check out more of our videos. We have plenty of inspiring and powerful stories waiting for you. Don't forget to hit the like button, subscribe, and turn on notifications so you never miss an update. See you in the next video.